Hey everyone, before I dive into this story that's left my heart both shattered and strangely satisfied, I need to ask you a favor. If this story resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the algorithm show this to more people who might need to hear it. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love knowing there are people all over the world sharing these experiences. Alright, here's my story. The moment my son Stephen walked into my hospital room and announced he'd sold our family farm behind my back was the moment I realized I'd raised a vulture instead of a child. "You're dying anyway, Mom," he said, pulling out his phone to show me some real estate document like he was sharing vacation photos. So I figured I'd get the money now instead of waiting for probate. That's when I smiled and delivered the words that would haunt him for weeks. "Too bad you didn't wait, sweetheart. You would have inherited the farm and everything I had buried in the backyard." Let me take you back to how we got here, because Stephen's betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was years in the making, and I was too blind to see it coming. 3 weeks ago, I collapsed in my kitchen while making Sunday dinner. The pain in my abdomen was so fierce I thought I was being split in half. Stephen found me there an hour later, curled up on the linoleum floor like a wounded animal. Instead of panic or concern, his first words were about the mess I'd made when the soup pot fell. At Kansas City General Hospital, Dr. Morrison delivered what we thought was a death sentence: pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Maybe 6 months if I was lucky. Stephen's reaction was telling, not tears or questions about treatment options, but an immediate inquiry about my will and whether all the paperwork was in order. The family farm had been in the Thompson name for 4 generations. My great-grandfather had claimed those 150 acres back in 1889, and every Thompson since had worked that land with their own hands. When Stephen was little, he'd follow me around the property like a devoted puppy, collecting eggs, feeding chickens, learning the rhythms of farm life. I thought he loved it as much as I did, but somewhere between his 18th birthday and his expensive college degree, Stephen decided farming was beneath him. He'd return for holidays with his perfectly manicured wife Jessica, their twin boys in their designer clothes, all of them treating my home like some quaint museum they were obligated to visit. "When are you going to sell this place and move somewhere civilized?" Jessica would ask, wrinkling her nose at the smell of fresh hay. Stephen would laugh and change the subject, but I caught the calculating looks he'd give the property, like he was already mentally dividing it up into dollar signs. Now, lying in this sterile hospital bed with machines beeping around me, I understood that he'd been planning this moment for years. The Concerned Son Act, the offers to help manage my affairs, it had all been preparation for this theft, but Stephen had made one critical error. He assumed I was helpless, confused, ready to fade away quietly. He had no idea that behind my grandmotherly facade lived a woman who'd survived the 1987 stock market crash, raised a family alone after my husband died, and successfully managed a working farm for 40 years. The fool also had no idea what I'd actually buried in that backyard. The day I buried my secrets, Stephen was 12 years old and convinced he was going to be a famous baseball player. He spent that entire summer of 1995 in the backyard practicing his swing against the old oak tree, completely oblivious to his mother digging holes in the moonlight like some deranged gardener. My husband Robert had died that spring, sudden heart attack while fixing the barn roof. At 46, I found myself alone with a grieving child and a mountain of debt Robert had hidden from me. The farm was mortgaged to the hilt, creditors were circling like buzzards, and Stephen's college fund had mysteriously vanished into Robert's failed business ventures. But Robert, bless his secretive heart, had left me one final gift: a safety deposit box I knew nothing about, containing information that would change everything. Insurance policies I'd never seen, old documents, and most importantly, a letter explaining why our seemingly poor dirt farm was actually sitting on something valuable. "The mineral rights, Maggie," his letter read in that familiar scrawl. Grandad Thompson knew what he was doing when he bought this land. The oil company's been sniffing around for decades, but I kept saying no. "If something happens to me, don't let them lowball you. That land is worth millions." He was right. Within 6 months of his death, Petroleum Solutions Incorporated came knocking with an offer that made my head spin, not to buy the land, but to lease the mineral rights for oil drilling. The signing bonus alone was enough to pay off every debt and fund Stephen's entire education. But here's the thing about sudden wealth: it makes you paranoid. I'd seen too many farm families torn apart by money, children fighting over inheritances, marriages destroyed by greed. I decided Stephen would inherit the farm naturally when I died, but the money needed protection from everyone, including my own son. I did what any sensible farm woman would do. I converted everything to cash and precious metals, put it all in waterproof containers, and buried it strategically around the property. Different spots, different depths, some marked only by coordinates I memorized. I told myself it was an emergency fund, protection against economic collapse, a guarantee that Stephen would always have something to fall back on. I never imagined I'd need protection from Stephen himself. Over the years, I added to my buried treasure, the yearly mineral rights payments, money from selling crops, even my social security checks. I kept enough for expenses and buried the rest. Stephen never questioned why I lived so modestly or why I claimed to be land-rich but cash-poor. He was too busy with his important city life to care about his mother's finances. By 2020, when the oil company negotiated a new lease agreement, my backyard contained more wealth than most people see in a lifetime. Stephen still brought his family for obligatory visits, still made jokes about Mom's old-fashioned ways, never knowing he was playing frisbee over a fortune. The irony wasn't lost on me. Stephen had sold the farm to get his hands on what he thought was my entire estate, maybe $50,000 in savings and an old house. If he'd shown even a shred of patience or human decency, he would have inherited millions. Instead, his greed had cost him everything. Lying in my hospital bed, watching his face cycle through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: perfect, crystalline satisfaction. Stephen thought he was so clever, manipulating a dying old woman. Too bad he had no idea this dying old woman had been playing chess while he was still learning checkers. Dr. Morrison's face was flushed with embarrassment when he walked into my room the next morning. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to apologize," he began, and I knew immediately that my world was about to flip upside down again. "The lab mixed up your results with another patient. You don't have pancreatic cancer." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. "Excuse me. You have a severe abdominal infection that's been masquerading as something much worse. It's completely treatable with antibiotics. You'll be going home in a few days, and with proper treatment, you should make a full recovery." I stared at him, processing this information while my mind raced through the implications. I wasn't dying. Stephen had sold our family farm based on false information, and somewhere in his panic greed, he'd just signed away his birthright for pennies on the dollar. The doctor continued explaining about infections and treatment protocols, but I'd stopped listening. Instead, I was calculating. Stephen thought he'd pulled off the perfect crime, stealing from a dying woman who'd be too dead to complain. But now I was very much alive, very much angry, and very much interested in teaching my son a lesson about consequences. After Dr. Morrison left, I reached for my phone and did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I called a lawyer. Not our old family attorney who'd helped Robert with farm business, but a sharp litigation firm in Kansas City that specialized in exactly the kind of problem I now faced. "Hawthorne and Associates, how may I help you?" "I need to speak with someone about fraud and elder abuse," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "My son sold my property without my knowledge or consent while I was hospitalized." Within 3 hours, Miranda Hawthorne herself was sitting beside my hospital bed with a legal pad and a recording device, tall, severe, and wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. She listened to my story with the kind of focused intensity that made me understand why she had a reputation for destroying people in court. "This is straightforward fraud," she said when I finished. "Your son forged your signature on legal documents while you were medically incapacitated. We can have the sale reversed and pursue criminal charges." "How long will that take?" "Months, possibly years. These things move slowly through the courts." I shook my head. "I want something faster, more direct." Miranda raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mrs. Thompson?" "I'm suggesting that Stephen believes I'm dying and that he's gotten away with theft. I'd like to keep him believing that for a while longer, at least until I figure out exactly how much damage he's done and how much justice he deserves." "You want to let him think he's won?" I want to let him dig his hole deeper. Men like Stephen don't stop at one crime. They get cocky and commit more, and the deeper he digs, the harder he'll fall when the truth comes out. Miranda smiled for the first time since entering my room. Mrs. Thompson, I think we are going to work very well together. That evening, Stephen called to check on my final arrangements. His voice oozed fake concern, but I could hear the excitement underneath. He'd probably already spent his blood money in his head, planning the vacation he'd take or the new car he'd buy. How are you feeling, Mom? Tired, I said, letting my voice sound weak and defeated. The doctors say it won't be much longer. I'm sorry this is so hard, but you know I'll take care of everything. The farm sale is all finalized, so you don't have to worry about any of that paperwork. The sheer audacity took my breath away. He was actually presenting his theft as a kindness, like he'd done me a favor by stealing my property. That's good, honey. I'm glad you're handling things. Try to rest, Mom. I'll see you soon. After he hung up, I lay in the dark planning. Stephen thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman on her deathbed. He had no idea he'd just declared war on someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Tomorrow I'd be discharged to what Stephen believed would be my final days. But instead of preparing for death, I'd be preparing for the most satisfying revenge of my life. The best part? Stephen had handed me all the ammunition I needed. The house felt different when I came home, violated somehow, like Stephen had already been through it with an appraiser's eye. I found evidence of his snooping everywhere, drawers left slightly open, papers not quite in their original positions, even my jewelry box showing signs of investigation. He'd been cataloguing my belongings like a vulture preparing for a feast. But Stephen had missed the most important thing entirely. While he'd been focused on obvious valuables, my grandmother's china, Robert's old tools, the antique furniture, he'd completely ignored the metal detector gathering dust in the basement. Robert had bought that detector 15 years ago during his brief treasure hunting phase. He'd spent weekends combing the property for Civil War artifacts and old coins, finding nothing but rusty nails and beer cans. I'd teased him about his expensive toy, never mentioning that I had my own use for it. Now, alone in my kitchen with the medical alert bracelet Stephen had insisted I wear, probably hoping it would summon an ambulance for my final moments, I retrieved Robert's detector and began the most important treasure hunt of my life. My first target was behind the old chicken coop, where I'd buried a waterproof case containing the original oil lease documents and approximately $50,000 in cash. The detector's steady beeping guided me to the exact spot, and within 20 minutes of digging, I was holding proof that Stephen had unknowingly sold property worth far more than he'd realized. The second site, near the apple orchard, yielded another case with gold coins and deed information showing the farm's true mineral rights value. The third, by the fence line, contained bank statements and legal documents proving the annual royalty payments I'd been receiving for years. By sunset, I had recovered 7 different caches, each containing evidence of wealth that Stephen had never suspected existed. The cash alone totaled nearly $300,000. The gold and silver added another $100,000. But the real treasure was the documentation proving that our worthless farm generated over $200,000 annually in mineral rights payments. Stephen thought he'd sold a rundown farm for $500,000, probably congratulating himself on getting such a good price for Mom's old place. He had no idea he'd just given away property generating that much income every 2.5 years, with millions more in untapped oil reserves. But here's what made it truly delicious. The sale contract required the new owners to honor all existing mineral rights agreements. Stephen had signed away the property, but not the ongoing royalty payments, which legally belonged to whoever held the mineral rights documentation, and I held all of it. My phone rang as I was reburying the last case, keeping just the documents and some cash for immediate needs. Stephen's number flashed on the screen. "Hi, honey," I answered, making my voice sound appropriately weak. "Mom, I've been thinking about your comfort during this difficult time. Maybe we should look into hospice care, make sure you have proper medical support." Translation: he wanted medical professionals to witness my decline and death, probably to avoid any questions about the convenient timing of the farm sale. "That's thoughtful, Stephen, but I'm managing okay for now." "Well, I also wanted to discuss some practical matters. You know, making sure all your affairs are in order. Have you thought about where you'd like the funeral service? What kind of arrangements you prefer? The man was actually planning my funeral while trying to sound caring. I had to admire his commitment to the performance. Oh, I've got some ideas about that, I said. And for the first time in days, I wasn't lying. Don't worry, Stephen. Everything will be exactly as it should be. After hanging up, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in Kansas City, Stephen was probably celebrating his successful theft, maybe even calling Jessica to share the good news about his windfall. He had no idea that his dying mother was very much alive, very much angry, and now holding enough legal ammunition to destroy his life completely. The farm was gone, yes, but the Betrayal treasure had been right under his feet the whole time. And he'd been too greedy and impatient to realize it. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone reveal exactly who they are. Tomorrow I'd begin phase 2 of my education program for my ungrateful son. Stephen arrived for his final visit with flowers and a funeral director's business card hidden in his jacket pocket. I saw him slip it back when he thought I wasn't looking, the same way he'd been hiding his true nature for years, but today I was ready to start pulling back the curtain on his performance. "You look tired, Mom," he said, settling into Robert's old chair with the confidence of someone who already considered himself the man of the house. "Are you sure you don't want me to arrange for some help? Maybe someone to stay with you?" "I'm fine for now, honey, though I have been thinking about what you said about getting my affairs in order." His eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "That's good, Mom. That's really good. Do you want me to call our attorney, help you review your will?" "Actually, I've been remembering some things your father told me before he died. About the property. About things he never got a chance to explain properly." Stephen leaned forward, trying to look concerned while practically salivating over potential new information about hidden assets. "What kind of things?" I let the silence stretch between us, watching him fidget. Finally, I spoke. "Stephen, when you sold the farm, did you happen to mention to the buyers that there might be other valuable items on the property?" "Other valuable items?" His voice cracked slightly. "Well, your father was always talking about contingency plans, emergency funds, things buried for safekeeping." I paused, studying his face. "I assume you told them about the possibilities when you negotiated the sale price." The color drained from Stephen's face as the implications hit him. If there was buried treasure on the property and he hadn't disclosed it, the new owners would legally own whatever they found. He'd essentially given away unknown wealth along with the land. "Buried," he whispered. "What exactly did Dad bury?" "Oh, you know your father, always worried about banks failing or the government taking everything. He converted quite a bit to cash and gold over the years, said it was insurance for the family." I watched Stephen's hands begin to shake. He was doing rapid mental calculations, probably figuring out how much money he might have accidentally included in his theft. His greed was warring with his panic, creating the most delicious internal conflict. "How much cash are we talking about, Mom?" "Oh, I couldn't say exactly. He handled all that. But he did mention once that it was enough to take care of us for the rest of our lives." I coughed delicately. "Of course, now that the property's sold, I suppose it belongs to the new owners." "Wait." Stephen stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Wait, we need to think about this. Maybe the sale isn't completely final yet. Maybe there's still time to renegotiate or add clauses about personal property." There it was, the exact reaction I'd been hoping for. Stephen was now frantically trying to figure out how to steal even more than he'd already stolen, which would require him to admit what he'd done. "I thought you said everything was finalized," I said innocently. "Well, yes, but there might be ways to modify the agreement, especially if there are material facts that weren't disclosed." He was thinking out loud now, too panicked to maintain his careful facade. "Mom, I need you to think carefully. Where might Dad have buried things? What did he tell you exactly?" "Stephen," I said, letting my voice carry just a hint of steel, "are you asking me to help you steal from the new property owners?" He froze, caught between his fake concern for his dying mother and his real concern for money he'd never legally owned. No, of course not. I just meant if there are family assets on the property, we should make sure they're properly accounted for. Family assets that you included when you sold my property without my permission. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Stephen's carefully constructed story was beginning to crumble, and we both knew it. Mom, I can explain. Oh, I think you've explained quite enough for one day, I said, reaching for my phone. I'm feeling very tired suddenly. Perhaps you should go home and think about exactly what you've done. Stephen left looking like a man who just realized he might have thrown away a winning lottery ticket, but the best part was yet to come. Tomorrow I'd let him discover just how winning that ticket really was. The morning sun hadn't even fully risen when I heard the sound of a car pulling into my driveway. I glanced at the clock, 6:15 a.m. Peering through my bedroom window, I saw Stephen's rental car parked haphazardly near the garden, and there he was, my 42-year-old son, unloading a brand new metal detector from his trunk like some desperate treasure hunter. I made myself a cup of coffee and settled into my favorite chair by the kitchen window, preparing to watch the show I'd orchestrated. And what a show it was. For the next 3 hours, Stephen systematically destroyed my landscaping. He dug holes near the old oak tree, by the fence line, around the chicken coop, everywhere I'd casually mentioned the night before. Sweat soaked through his expensive Ralph Lauren shirt. Mud caked his designer loafers. And with each empty hole, I could see his desperation growing. Around 9 a.m., I decided it was time for Act 2 of my performance. I put on my worn bathrobe, mussed my hair to look appropriately frail, and shuffled outside with a glass of sweet tea. Stephen? Honey, what on earth are you doing out here so early? He jumped like he'd been caught robbing a bank, which, in a way, he had. His face was flushed, whether from exertion or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. Mom, I didn't hear you come out. I was just, the garden looked like it needed some work, and I thought I'd help you out. I looked at the war zone he'd created, holes everywhere, dirt piled in mounds, my prized rose bushes trampled. That's very thoughtful, dear, but it looks like you're searching for something specific. His eyes darted away. No, just general maintenance. You know how Dad always said a good garden needs turning over. Your father never said that in his life. I let the words hang there, watching him squirm. But speaking of your father, I've been having the strangest dreams about him lately. He keeps telling me to remember, to not forget where he put things. Stephen's head snapped up so fast I heard his neck crack. What things, Mom? What exactly is Dad telling you in these dreams? I pretended to struggle with my memory, touching my temple in that confused elderly way. It's all so fuzzy. Numbers, coordinates maybe? And something about a red metal box near the well? Or was it the blue one by the shed? I just can't seem to hold onto the details anymore. There are boxes. Multiple boxes. His voice had gone up an octave. Mom, this is really important. I need you to focus. What else did Dad say? Well, there was something about the orchard, and maybe the old storm cellar? Oh, and he was always so paranoid about banks, wasn't he? He must have hidden quite a lot over the years. I sighed heavily. Too bad the property isn't ours anymore. Whoever bought it is going to get quite a surprise when they find everything. I watched the color drain from Stephen's face as the full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. He'd sold property that potentially contained hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, in hidden assets. And it was all legally belonging to the new owners now. Mom, we need to talk. Seriously talk. He grabbed my arm a bit too roughly, then caught himself and loosened his grip. Let's go inside. Over the next 30 minutes, sitting at my kitchen table, I watched my son unravel. It started with small admissions. I may have acted hastily with the sale, and progressed to larger ones. I didn't exactly follow proper legal procedures. But he still couldn't bring himself to say the words, I forged your signature and committed fraud. Instead, he danced around it, justifying every action. He thought he was protecting me from stress. He believed he was doing what was best for the family. The doctors said I was dying, so what did it matter if he expedited things? Stephen, I finally said, cutting through his rationalizations, did you or did you not sell my farm without my permission? He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. I signed the papers for you. You were so sick, and I thought, you forged my signature. That's such an ugly way to put it. I prefer to think of it as acting on your behalf in a time of crisis. The audacity was breathtaking. He'd literally committed a felony and was trying to rebrand it as filial devotion. And how much did you get for this favor you did me? 500,000. I got 500,000 for the property. I nodded slowly, doing some mental math for effect. And this 500,000, where is it now? His face told me everything before he even opened his mouth. The money was gone. Spent. Vaporized into his suburban lifestyle like morning dew. The house needed repairs. Jessica wanted that kitchen remodel she's been talking about for years. The boys' school tuition, my business investments, a few outstanding debts, it all added up. But it's okay because it was going to be my inheritance anyway, right? I just accessed it a little early. Accessed it early. I repeated his words back to him, letting him hear how they sounded. Is that what we are calling theft now? Mom, don't be dramatic. Dramatic. My voice, which had been soft and confused all morning, suddenly sharpened to a razor's edge. You stole my property, Stephen. You forged legal documents while I was in a hospital bed. You committed fraud. And now you're standing in my kitchen trying to convince me, and yourself, that you're the victim here. He flinched like I'd slapped him. I'm not saying I'm the victim. I'm just trying to explain. Then let me explain something to you. I stood up, and despite my age, despite my bathrobe and mussed hair, I must have looked formidable because Stephen actually took a step back. That farm you sold for $500,000? It generates $200,000 a year in mineral rights royalties. Every single year. Has been for the past 15 years, and the geological surveys say it'll continue for at least 30 more. I let him do the math. Watched his face go from confusion to comprehension to absolute horror. That's $12 million, he whispered. Over the life of the reserves, that's $12 million. Was $12 million. Now it belongs to the Martinez family, who bought the property from you, along with the surface rights, water rights, and everything else you signed away. Stephen's legs seemed to give out. He collapsed back into his chair, his face the color of old newspaper. But the contract, there must be a way to void it. Medical incompetence, undue influence, something. I wasn't incompetent, Stephen. Dr. Morrison will testify to that. I was fully lucid when you forged my signature. I paused. By the way, there's something else I should mention. The doctors made a mistake with my diagnosis. I don't have cancer. I'm going to live for a very long time. If his face had been pale before, it was ghostly now. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. So you see, I continued pleasantly, I'll be around to watch exactly what happens to you when the full weight of your actions comes down. And trust me, Stephen, it's going to come down hard. Mom, please. He was crying now, actual tears streaming down his face. But I could see they weren't tears of remorse, they were tears of loss. He was mourning the money, not the relationship. We can fix this. We are family. Family forgives family. Family also doesn't steal from family. But since you brought up the subject of what families do, I pulled out my phone and made a call. Miranda? He's here. You can come in now. The look of confusion on Stephen's face turned to panic when Miranda Hawthorne walked through my front door, followed by Sheriff Deputy Tom Brennan. Stephen Thompson? Deputy Brennan asked, though it was clearly rhetorical. Yes. You're under arrest for elder fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. You have the right to remain silent. As the deputy read Stephen his rights and placed handcuffs on his wrists, my son looked at me with betrayal in his eyes. as if I had wronged him by refusing to let him get away with stealing my life's work. Mom, don't do this. Think about Jessica, think about your grandchildren. I am thinking about them, I said quietly. I'm thinking about what kind of lesson they'll learn if their father faces no consequences for his crimes. I'm thinking about what kind of person you'll become if you're allowed to believe that family is just something to exploit when convenient. The deputy led Stephen toward the door, but I had one more thing to say. Stephen? That treasure you spent all morning looking for? It's already been recovered and secured. Every penny of it. And it's going to fund a very comfortable life for me, somewhere far away from here, where children who steal from their parents can't find me. The last thing I saw before the door closed was the look of complete devastation on my son's face. Not because he'd lost his mother, but because he'd lost access to money he'd never actually earned. Miranda stayed behind after the deputy drove away with Stephen. We stood in my torn-up garden, looking at all the holes he'd dug in his desperate treasure hunt. How do you feel? She asked. Like I've spent 42 years raising a stranger, I admitted. But also, free. Is that terrible? It's honest. She pulled out a folder from her briefcase. The district attorney will be filing formal charges by end of business today. Given the evidence, the forged documents, the recorded confessions, the witness statements, he's looking at 2 to 5 years in federal prison, plus full restitution. He doesn't have any money to make restitution. Then he'll spend a very long time paying it back. His house is already in foreclosure proceedings. His business is being liquidated. And Jessica filed for divorce this morning. I felt a pang at that. Not for Stephen, but for Jessica and the boys. They were innocent victims of his greed. The mineral rights have reverted to you, Miranda continued. The Martinez family was surprisingly understanding when we explained the situation. The sale contract had a fraud clause that nullified the transfer of mineral rights in cases of criminal activity. They keep the surface property, which they genuinely wanted for farming, and you keep the subsurface rights. So I get my income back. Every penny. The oil company has already been notified and they're resuming payments to your account. You're looking at roughly $200,000 a year for the foreseeable future. $200,000 a year. More money than I'd ever need, especially living alone. An idea began forming in my mind. Miranda, what would happen if I set up a trust? For my grandchildren's education? She smiled. I think that would be very generous of you. And completely legal. Stephen doesn't get to know about it. Not until the boys are in college and the money's already been spent on their futures. But I won't let them suffer for their father's sins. You're a better person than most would be in your situation. I'm a mother, I corrected. I'm angry at my son, maybe I'll never forgive him, but I still love those boys. They deserve a chance Stephen threw away. Over the next 6 months, I watched from a distance as Stephen's perfect life crumbled. The trial was quick. His own recorded words damned him more thoroughly than any prosecutor could. He got 3 years in federal prison, with possibility of parole after 18 months for good behavior. Jessica took the boys and moved back to her family in Oregon. I sent her a letter, not forgiving Stephen, but asking if I could stay in touch with my grandchildren. She agreed, with the condition that all contact go through her first. Fair enough. I sold my house, the one with the torn-up garden and too many painful memories, and bought a small cottage in Asheville, North Carolina. Far enough from Kansas that Stephen would never think to look for me there, close enough to Oregon that I could visit the boys a couple times a year. I legally changed my name to Margaret Collins. Got a new social security card, new driver's license, new everything. As far as the world was concerned, Maggie Thompson had ceased to exist. The oil money came in like clockwork every quarter. I lived on a fraction of it and invested the rest. The trust for the boys grew larger every year. By the time they were ready for college, there would be enough to pay for medical school, law school, or whatever dreams they wanted to chase. 2 years into Stephen's sentence, I received a letter. It had been forwarded through 3 different addresses and 2 law firms, but it finally found me. The return address was FCI Englewood, the minimum security federal prison where Stephen was serving his time. I almost threw it away unopened. But curiosity won out. The letter was 12 pages long, handwritten in Stephen's careful script. It talked about the prison programs he'd completed: financial literacy, ethics, cognitive behavioral therapy. It talked about the books he'd read and the realizations he'd had about his actions. It talked about how sorry he was, how much he'd lost, how much he regretted everything. But nowhere in those 12 pages did he actually take full responsibility. It was all mistakes were made, and if I could go back, and the pressure I was under. Always finding ways to contextualize, to explain, to soften the hard edges of what he'd done. I read it twice, then filed it away in a drawer. Maybe someday I'd respond. But not today. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, a photo of Tommy and Tyler at their soccer game, grinning in their muddy uniforms. They looked happy, healthy, free from the toxicity their father had created. "Grandma, when are you coming to visit?" Tommy had written. "Mom says maybe for Thanksgiving." I smiled and typed back, "Count on it. I'll bring pie." At 68 years old, I had finally learned the difference between family and relatives. Relatives are the people you're born to. Family is the people who earn the right to stay in your life through love, respect, and basic human decency. Stephen was my relative. But he was no longer my family. Tommy and Tyler, though? They were family. And I'd move heaven and earth to make sure they never turned out like their father. The mineral rights payments continued. The cottage was paid off. I had more money than I could spend in 2 lifetimes. But more importantly, I had peace. I had autonomy. I had the freedom to choose who I let into my life and who I kept out. Stephen had tried to steal my legacy. Instead, he'd given me the greatest gift possible: the courage to walk away from people who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with a pulse. 6 months later, Stephen was released on parole. He tried to find me, of course. Called every Thompson in the Kansas phone book. Hired a private investigator who spent 3 weeks chasing dead ends. Even posted on social media asking if anyone had seen his mother, Maggie Thompson. But Maggie Thompson no longer existed. And Margaret Collins had no son. I heard through Jessica that he'd moved into a halfway house in Kansas City. Got a job as an assistant manager at a sporting goods store, a far cry from his previous position as a financial consultant. He was driving a 10-year-old Honda and living in a studio apartment with furniture from Goodwill. Good. Let him rebuild from nothing. Let him understand what it means to start over with no safety net, no family money, no inheritance waiting in the wings. That's what I'd had to do after Robert died. That's what every Thompson before me had to do. Maybe if Stephen experienced true hardship, he'd finally understand the value of what he'd thrown away. Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd spend the rest of his life bitter and resentful, convinced he was the victim of circumstance rather than the architect of his own downfall. Either way, it was no longer my problem. On Thanksgiving, I flew to Oregon and spent a week with Jessica and the boys. We made turkey and stuffing, watched football, played board games late into the night. The boys never asked about their father. Jessica had explained, in age-appropriate terms, that Daddy had made some very serious mistakes and had to face consequences. They seemed to accept this with the resilience of children. Or maybe they were just relieved not to be walking on eggshells anymore, trying to live up to the impossible standards Stephen had set for them. On my last day there, Tommy pulled me aside. At 13, he was already showing signs of the man he'd become: thoughtful, kind, with his grandfather Robert's gentle eyes. "Grandma, Mom won't tell me exactly what Dad did. But whatever it was, I want you to know I'm sorry. And I'm going to make sure I never do anything like that." I hugged him tight, this boy who carried no blame but felt the need to apologize anyway. "Tommy, you are not responsible for your father's choices. Never apologize for someone else's mistakes. Just focus on being the best version of yourself you can be. That's all anyone can ask. Will you come visit us again? For Christmas maybe. Try and stop me." Flying home to Asheville, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine, uncomplicated happiness. I'd lost a son, yes. But I'd gained myself back. And in the end, that was worth more than all the oil money in Kansas. The cottage felt warm and welcoming when I walked through the door. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite chair with a book I'd been meaning to read. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, dusting the mountains in white. My phone buzzed. Another letter had been forwarded from Stephen. This one was shorter, just 3 pages. Still full of justifications and if-onlys, but with slightly more acknowledgement of actual wrongdoing, progress, perhaps. Or just better coaching from his therapist. I filed it away with the first letter, unread beyond the opening paragraph. Maybe someday I'd want to read his attempts at redemption. But today wasn't that day. Today, I was too busy living the life he'd inadvertently given me. One free from obligation, free from manipulation, free from people who saw family as something to exploit rather than cherish. The snow continued to fall, and I was exactly where I wanted to be. Not in Kansas. Not near Stephen. Not accessible to anyone who thought my value lay in what they could take from me rather than who I was. At 68 years old, I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is knowing when to walk away, and I'd walked away with my head held high, my bank account full, and my dignity intact. Stephen had tried to bury me before my time. Instead, he'd buried himself under the weight of his own greed, and me? I was flying.